Princess Lyra of the Vethrolians sat quietly on her throne, the weight of her crown feeling heavier than usual. She had always been proud of her heritage. Her people were known for their extraordinary minds, able to connect with each other through powerful telepathy. Their intellectual abilities had made the Vethrolians a dominant force in the galaxy. But Lyra's condition had set her apart in a way that felt like a curse. Unlike her peers, she could not connect with others in the way that was expected. Her telepathic abilities had never fully developed, leaving her isolated in a sea of brilliant minds. She could hear the whispers of doubt around her, the quiet judgment from her own people. In a society that prided itself on mental strength, Lyra was considered an anomaly, a flaw in the genetic perfection that the Vethrolians had worked so hard to maintain. Over the years, Lyra had faced rejection from countless suitors, each more powerful and influential than the last. They all turned away from her, disinterested in a princess whose telepathic abilities were weak. Some claimed it was a sign of weakness, others said it was a sign of bad blood. Either way, her status as a future ruler was seen as uncertain. Each rejection left a scar, and the princess had become numb to it. She had learned to smile and nod when the whispers started, learned to wear her royal mask when surrounded by the political elite. But inside, she was losing hope. She was the last of her royal line, and her people expected her to marry someone powerful enough to help her rule. Yet, no one wanted her, not truly. The palace corridors were filled with empty promises. Lyra had been promised the best of everything: wealth, power, and influence, but never love or respect. Her mother, the late queen, had always told her to be patient, that one day the right suitor would come. But the days turned to weeks, and the weeks to years, and still, no one saw her for who she was. Princess Lyra of the Vethrolians, worthy of a throne, even if her abilities were not perfect. She wandered the halls of the palace that day, the echoes of her footsteps, the only sound in the vast empty spaces. She wondered what it would be like to be seen for who she truly was, not as a failure, not as a disappointment, but as someone who could be loved and respected for more than her abilities. Then, as if the universe itself had heard her silent plea, he appeared, a human, in the grand palace of the Vethrolians. At first, Lyra thought it was some mistake. Humans were not common visitors to her world, and certainly not at such high-level events. His name was Jason Ford, a young ambassador sent to strengthen the alliance between humans and Vethrolians. When their eyes met, something unusual happened. Lyra didn't feel the weight of judgment. She didn't feel the harsh, unspoken criticism that was usually there when people looked at her. Instead, Jason smiled at her, genuinely, warmly, and for the first time in years, she felt as if someone might actually see her for who she was. She didn't know it yet, but Jason Ford would be the one to offer her a chance at something she had almost given up on: hope. The next day, the royal palace was alive with the buzz of important diplomatic talks. The Vethrolians had long been the dominant force in their corner of the galaxy, and their alliances were always crucial to maintaining peace. But today, something was different. Today, the human ambassador, Lieutenant Jason Ford, had come to the palace for the first time, and no one could ignore his presence. Jason was unlike the others Lyra had met. He wasn't as tall as the Vethrolians, and his skin was a warm shade of brown, different from the pale, silver-toned skin of her people. His eyes, however, were what struck her most. They were a deep, almost unearthly blue, clear and calm, yet full of curiosity. While the other diplomats and nobles spoke with formal politeness, Jason's manner was refreshingly open. His voice had a warmth that made Lyra feel at ease, unlike the cold, calculated conversations she was used to. She watched him from across the room as he shook hands with the Vethrolian leaders. The others in the room appeared uncomfortable, unsure of what to make of this human in their midst. But Jason stood tall, his calm demeanor bringing a certain charm to his awkwardness. Lyra noticed that while he might not be the most imposing figure in the room, he had an aura of quiet confidence. She wondered for the briefest moment what it would be like to speak with him, without the judgment or expectations that came from her own people. There was something about him that felt different. Maybe it was his kindness, or maybe it was his complete lack of judgment. Later that evening, during a quiet gathering in the royal gardens, Lyra found herself face to face with Jason. She wasn't sure why she had sought him out. Perhaps it was the feeling of relief she had when she saw him earlier, or perhaps she just wanted to escape the political games that always seemed to dominate her life. Jason turned to her as she approached, and for the first time, he didn't look at her like a princess to be respected or a symbol of royalty to be admired. He simply saw her as another person. Princess Lyra. He greeted her with a smile that seemed genuine. It's an honor to meet you outside of all the politics. Lyra couldn't help but smile in return, though it was a small one. It's strange, isn't it? She said, her voice soft. All these formalities and rules. It feels like no one ever sees me. Just the crown, the throne, the duty. Jason's expression softened. I imagine it must be exhausting, living under such expectations. Lyra looked away for a moment, her thoughts drifting. She didn't know why she was telling him this. It wasn't like her to open up to anyone, especially not a stranger. But something about Jason made it feel easy, as though he didn't see her as some distant ruler, but as a person who carried the weight of the universe on her shoulders. I'm different from my people, Lyra admitted quietly. They think I'm weak because I don't have their abilities. My telepathy, it's not like theirs. It never fully developed. She paused, unsure if she should say more, but the words kept coming. I've been rejected by so many. Suitors, politicians, even my own people. I'm not what they want. Jason's eyes softened, and for a moment, there was silence between them. He didn't offer empty words of sympathy, and he didn't treat her like a fragile thing. Instead, he simply nodded, as though he understood. I think, Jason said, his voice steady, that sometimes people are too focused on what's perfect. They forget that true strength isn't just in what's visible, but in who you are beneath all that. You're more than your abilities, Lyra. Lyra felt something stir inside her. For the first time in a long while, someone had truly seen her, not as a princess, but as a person. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this way. As the night went on, Jason and Lyra talked more about their worlds, their hopes, and their struggles. There was no pretense, no masks. Just two people trying to make sense of their place in the galaxy. Lyra felt a strange sense of peace in his presence, something she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know it yet, but this human, this ambassador, was about to change her life in ways she never could have imagined. The days that followed were filled with formal meetings, endless discussions, and the usual political banter. Yet, despite the busy schedule, Lyra found herself thinking about Jason Ford more often than she cared to admit. It wasn't just his words that lingered in her mind, but the way he treated her, like a person, not a princess. In a world full of expectations and rules, Jason was a breath of fresh air. One evening, after another long day of talks, Lyra walked through the grand palace gardens, trying to clear her mind. She had just stepped outside when she spotted Jason sitting alone on a stone bench, looking up at the stars. He didn't seem to mind the quiet, and for once, the world around her felt still. Couldn't sleep either, she asked, stepping closer. Jason turned and smiled when he saw her. Not really. A lot on my mind, he said with a shrug. But I find the stars help me think. There's something peaceful about them, don't you think? Lyra nodded. She hadn't always thought of the stars that way, but tonight, under their soft glow, they seemed less distant. She sat next to him on the bench, the silence between them comfortable. After a while, Lyra spoke again, her voice quieter this time. Do you ever wonder what it's like to be free of all the weight of expectations? To just be yourself, without worrying about your place in the world? Jason's expression softened. He had always sensed the burden that Lyra carried, but hearing her speak about it so openly made him understand just how heavy it must be. "I imagine it's hard," he said thoughtfully. "But I also think that if anyone could handle that kind of pressure, it's you. I've seen you stand your ground in every meeting. You don't back down." Lyra smiled faintly, but didn't respond. She was quiet for a moment, wondering if she should share more of her feelings with him. But before she could, Jason spoke again, his voice calm and sincere. "I've been thinking," Jason began, choosing his words carefully, "about what you said the other day. About not feeling like you fit in, like you're always being rejected. I want you to know that I don't see you that way." Lyra turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "I don't see you as someone weak or impaired," he continued. "You're strong, Lyra, in a way that goes beyond anything your people can measure. And I believe in you." Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time someone had said something kind to her, but it was the first time someone had said it like they truly meant it, without the usual expectations attached. Jason paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "And because I believe in you, I want to offer you something. Something that might seem strange at first." Lyra raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Jason took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know this might sound out of place, but I want to offer you my hand in marriage. Not because of political gain or any diplomatic reason, but because I see you, Lyra, not as a princess or a ruler, but as a person who deserves more than to be rejected, someone who deserves to be loved for who they are. I want to be that person for you." Lyra was stunned into silence. The proposal hung in the air, and for a moment, everything around them seemed to fade. She wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly. Jason Ford, the human ambassador, was offering to marry her, simply because he believed in her. "But why?" she asked, her voice soft with disbelief. "Why would you want to marry me? A princess with no true power. A princess who isn't what they expect." Jason smiled gently. "Because I don't see you as a princess, Lyra. I see you as someone who deserves the chance to live freely, to be who you are without anyone telling you that you're not good enough. And if you'll have me, I want to be the one who supports you in that. Not as a political move, but as someone who cares about you." Lyra felt something stir deep within her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. For the first time, someone had offered her something pure, something real. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, Lyra allowed herself to wonder if this could be the beginning of something truly different. The days following Jason's unexpected proposal were filled with confusion and uncertainty for Princess Lyra. She spent hours wandering the royal palace, trying to find answers to the swirling thoughts in her mind. It wasn't just the shock of his offer. It was everything it meant. A human, a stranger from a distant world, had offered her something no one from her own people ever had: genuine acceptance. Lyra had always known that her path in life would be dictated by the expectations of her people. As a Vithrolian princess, she was expected to marry someone who was not only strong but also powerful, someone who could support her rule and enhance the prestige of the Vithrolian Empire. For her, that had always meant a Vithrolian prince, someone with a sharp mind, a high rank, and the respect of her people. But Jason Ford was none of those things. He was a human, from a species considered inferior by the Vithrolians. He lacked the mental abilities that her people so valued, and yet he had seen something in her that no one else had. That thought kept haunting her. Why had Jason offered her his hand in marriage? Was it truly out of compassion, or did he have some hidden agenda? Lyra's mind raced with questions, and every time she thought about the possibility of accepting his offer, a feeling of both excitement and fear filled her chest. She had been rejected so many times in her life, not just by potential suitors, but by her own people. They didn't value her because of her impairment, her inability to connect with others through the powerful telepathic bond that defined their species. In their eyes, she wasn't worthy of being their ruler. So when Jason had offered her his hand, It was a gesture that cut through all the years of rejection. But could she really accept it? Could she marry a human who was so different from everything her people had ever known? The weight of her responsibility as the heir to the Vethrolian throne pressed down on her, and with it, the burden of her people's expectations. Her advisors, her family, they would never approve. They would see it as a betrayal of everything the Vethrolians stood for. Yet, as the days passed, the more Lyra thought about Jason's offer, the more she realized that she didn't want to live the rest of her life according to other people's standards. She had spent so many years trying to meet the expectations of those around her, but it had never brought her happiness. Jason's proposal, though unexpected, felt like a chance at something different, a chance to live freely, to be loved for who she was, and not for what she could offer in terms of power or ability. The more she thought about it, the clearer her heart became. She didn't need to live in the shadow of her people's judgment. She didn't need to marry someone simply because it was expected. Taking a deep breath, Lyra made up her mind. She would go to Jason and tell him what she had decided, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, both from her own people and from the galaxy at large. But for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came her way. The decision was made. Lyra would take a chance, not just on Jason, but on herself. She was done letting others define her. This was her life, and she would live it on her terms. With newfound determination, she set out to find Jason. It was time to tell him what she had decided. "You said." Princess Lyra stood at the grand balcony of the palace, staring out into the vast expanse of the Vethrolian sky. The stars twinkled like 1,000 scattered dreams, and for the first time in years, she felt like one of those stars, small, yet full of potential. She had made her decision. Now, all that was left was to face Jason and tell him what she had decided. It wasn't an easy decision. The pressure of her royal duties, the weight of her people's expectations, and the fear of what might come next swirled in her mind. But despite all of this, Lyra felt a calmness she hadn't known in a long time. The thought of rejecting Jason's offer felt like turning her back on the chance of something real, something honest. For the first time in her life, she didn't want to be confined by the rules and expectations of others. She took a deep breath, pushing aside the last of her doubts. The path she was about to walk was uncertain, but it was hers to walk. The truth was, she had never felt like she belonged in the Vethrolian court. She had always been the outcast, the one who didn't fit. But Jason had made her feel seen in a way no one else ever had. As she turned to leave the balcony and make her way to the meeting room, where Jason was waiting, Lyra's heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and fear. She didn't know how he would react. Maybe he would be relieved. Maybe he would be disappointed. But she couldn't let fear dictate her actions any longer. When she entered the room, Jason was sitting by a large window, looking out at the stars. He turned as he heard her footsteps, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. "Lyra," he said softly, his voice full of warmth. "I'm glad you came." Lyra stepped forward, feeling the weight of the moment. "Jason," she began, her voice steady but soft. "I've thought a lot about what you said, about what you offered me, and I've made my decision." Jason's eyes searched her face, waiting for her to continue. "I accept your offer," Lyra said, her words clear and confident. "I will marry you." The room was silent for a moment as Jason processed her words. Then, a smile slowly spread across his face, and his eyes sparkled with a mixture of relief and joy. You really mean it?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "You're saying yes?" Lyra nodded, feeling the strange sense of peace settle over her. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I want to be with you, Jason. I want to build a life that isn't defined by anyone else's expectations. I want to be free. And I think we can do that together." Jason stood up, walking toward her with a smile that made her heart flutter. "Lyra," he whispered, reaching out to take her hand, "I don't know what the future holds, but I promise you this. I will always stand by your side. You don't have to face this alone." For a moment, they simply stood there, holding hands, the weight of their decision settling in. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time, Lyra felt like she wasn't alone. She had found someone who saw her for who she truly was, someone who cared for her not because of her status, but because of her heart. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "Together." Jason smiled, his grip on her hand tightening. "Together," he agreed. And for the first time in her life, Lyra felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The days that followed Lyra's decision to marry Jason were filled with a flurry of activity. Though their engagement was not officially announced yet, it felt as if the entire palace was holding its breath. Whispers swirled among the courtiers and advisors, but Lyra found that she didn't care. She had made her choice, and for the first time, it was her choice, not one made for her. Jason had spent most of his time helping with diplomatic matters and strengthening the bond between the Vithrolians and humans, but he also found time to spend with Lyra. They would meet in quiet corners of the palace, away from the prying eyes of the royal court. They talked about everything, about their hopes for the future, about their worlds, and about the challenges they would face together. Though Lyra's heart was lighter than it had been in years, she knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Her people, the Vithrolians, were proud and set in their ways. They would not understand why she had chosen to marry a human, someone with no telepathic ability, no mental powers. To them, it might seem like a mistake, or worse, a betrayal. Jason had told her more than once that he didn't care what her people thought. He cared only for her, and he would support her no matter what. Lyra admired his confidence, but she also knew that their union would not be accepted easily. She would have to face the consequences of her decision, and it was something that weighed heavily on her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Lyra and Jason sat on the balcony, looking out over the palace grounds. There was a sense of peace in the air, but also an underlying tension. Lyra could feel it in her chest, the awareness that soon her decision would have to be revealed to everyone. "Do you think they'll accept us?" Lyra asked, her voice soft but laced with worry. Jason turned to her, his expression calm. "I don't know what they'll do," he admitted. "But I do know this. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. If they can't accept us, that's their problem, not yours." Lyra smiled faintly, touched by his words. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. "It's not just about us, though. It's about my people. I'm their princess. They expect me to be perfect, to make the right choices. And this?" She hesitated, her thoughts clouding. "This isn't what they expected." Jason reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Then let them see you for who you are, not for what they think you should be." His words comforted her more than she had expected. Still, the reality of what lay ahead was hard to ignore. The royal council would have to be informed. The elders and her family would have their say. She would have to stand before them and tell them that she was marrying the human, a choice that might cost her everything. Yet, as Jason's hand squeezed hers, Lyra felt a new kind of strength growing within her. This was her life. She had spent so long hiding behind expectations, behind the perfect image of a princess. It was time to step out of the shadows and into the light, to stand up for the love she had chosen. "You're right," Lyra said quietly, her voice filled with newfound resolve. "I don't need their approval. I need to live for us." Jason smiled, and for the first time in a long while, Lyra felt as though she could face anything. The road ahead would be difficult, but she wasn't alone. Together, they could face whatever challenges came their way. And for the first time, Lyra felt ready to embrace the future. The day of the announcement had arrived. Princess Lyra stood in front of the grand mirror in her chambers, adjusting the fabric of her gown. Her heart raced, and her stomach twisted with nervousness. She had spent so many years trying to please others, living a life that was never truly hers. But today, everything was going to change. She was about to reveal to her people the decision she had made. She was going to marry Jason Ford, the human ambassador. Outside her chamber, the royal court was already gathered in the Great Hall, waiting for the formal declaration. Lyra's family, her advisors, and even the elders, people who had never once believed in her abilities, were all present. Lyra could hear their voices from the hallway, murmuring, gossiping, and speculating about the reason for this unexpected gathering. The tension was thick. She looked at her reflection one last time, taking a deep breath. Her usual regal composure was in place. But inside, she was anything but composed. She was about to challenge everything her people believed in. "Are you ready, princess?" A soft voice asked from the door. It was one of her attendants, a young woman named Mira, who had always been kind to her. Lyra nodded, though her hands were shaking. "I suppose I have no choice but to be ready now." Mira smiled gently. "You've made a brave decision, princess. Whatever happens today, remember that it's your life. You are the one who must live it." Those words, simple as they were, gave Lyra the strength she needed. She took one last look at herself, steeled her resolve, and walked out of her chambers. As she entered the grand hall, all eyes turned to her. The room fell silent. Lyra could feel the weight of their gazes, their judgment. The nobles, the advisors, her family, they were all waiting for her to speak. Jason stood near the center of the room, looking as calm as ever. He didn't seem nervous at all. In fact, he looked as though he had been preparing for this moment for a long time. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, the noise of the world around her disappeared. In that moment, it was just the two of them. Lyra stepped forward, taking her place beside Jason. She could feel the tension in the air, the disbelief, the silent questioning from the crowd. She stood tall, forcing herself to meet their eyes, even as her heart raced. "My people," Lyra began, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "Today, I stand before you not as your princess, but as a woman who has made a choice for myself." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Lyra could see the confusion and disapproval on the faces of those present. They had no idea where this was going. "I have decided to marry Jason Ford," Lyra continued, her words clear and firm. "Not because of his position, not because of his power, but because he sees me for who I truly am. For the first time, someone has accepted me for who I am, without the expectations of royalty, without the burden of my status. And that is why I choose him." The hall was silent. No one moved, no one spoke. Lyra could feel the weight of their gaze pressing down on her. She braced herself for the storm of reactions she knew was coming. But then, Jason stepped forward. He stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her arm. "I love Lyra for who she is," he said, his voice steady and strong. "I will stand by her side, not as a conqueror, but as her equal. No matter what anyone thinks, we are united in this decision." At first, the room remained still. The tension was palpable. But then, something unexpected happened. A quiet voice from the back of the hall spoke up. "I believe in this," the voice said. It was one of the younger advisors, a woman named Alia, who had always admired Lyra's courage. "If the princess has chosen this path, then we should respect it." Slowly, others began to murmur their agreement. It wasn't unanimous, and there were still many skeptical eyes, but the tide had started to shift. Lyra realized then that perhaps, just perhaps, her people were willing to listen. The weight that had settled on her shoulders lightened ever so slightly. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, Lyra felt like she wasn't facing it alone. She had Jason by her side, and together, they would face whatever came next. The days after the announcement were filled with uncertainty. While there had been some support, especially from the younger advisors, the majority of the royal court still disapproved of Lyra's choice. Whispers followed her wherever she went, and the tension within the palace was undeniable. Some even openly questioned her decision, suggesting she was acting recklessly. Lyra had always known that her people valued tradition above all else. The idea of a human, someone from a lesser species in their eyes, marrying their princess was something they could not easily accept. There were many in the palace who saw it as a dangerous step, one that could weaken the position of the Vethrolian Empire in the galaxy. But Lyra was resolute. She had chosen to follow her heart, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that away from her. She spent the days after the announcement working closely with Jason, planning for the future. They talked about what their marriage would mean for both of their people. It wasn't going to be easy, but they were determined to find a way to make it work. The road ahead was uncertain, but Lyra felt that for the first time in her life, she was making her own decisions. Still, there were moments of doubt. One evening, as Lyra sat alone in her chamber, she couldn't help but think about the consequences of her actions. What would happen to her people? Would they turn against her? She had no answers, and the fear of the unknown weighed heavily on her mind. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. "Princess." It was Mira, the young attendant who had been so kind to her. "There is someone here to see you." Lyra glanced up, startled. "Who?" Mira stepped into the room, followed by a tall figure Lyra didn't recognize. He was dressed in the traditional robes of a Vethrolian noble, his expression stern and unreadable. "This is Lord Varric," Mira explained. "He is one of the elders of the Royal Council." Lyra's stomach tightened. She had heard of Lord Varric. He was known for his strict adherence to Vethrolian traditions. She knew this meeting was not going to be easy. "Princess Lyra," Lord Varric began, his voice cold and formal. "I have come to discuss the recent decision you have made." Lyra stood tall, trying to hide the nervousness in her chest. "I am listening, Lord Varric. I speak on behalf of the council," Lord Varric continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your choice to marry a human is a disgrace to the Vethrolian people. We are a proud race, and we do not lower ourselves by forming alliances with inferior species. Your decision threatens the very foundation of our empire. You have caused a great disturbance." The word struck her like a blow. Lyra felt her heart race, but she didn't let it show. She had prepared for this moment, and she would not back down now. "I understand your concerns, Lord Varric," Lyra said, her voice steady. "But I am the princess. I have the right to make my own choices. My marriage to Jason Ford is not about weakening the empire. It is about making a choice that is mine to make. It is about love, not politics." Lord Varric sneered. "Love? You speak of love, but what of your people? What of the traditions that have kept our empire strong for centuries?" Lyra met his gaze firmly. "What if love is the very thing that can make our empire stronger? What if it is time to evolve, to look beyond what has always been? I will not live my life for the approval of others, Lord Varric. I will live it for myself." For a moment, the room was silent. Lord Varric's gaze was sharp, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps surprise, beneath his stern exterior. "You are a fool, princess," he said after a long pause. "But I see you are determined." Lyra nodded. "I am, and I will not be swayed." Lord Varric turned to leave, his robe sweeping behind him as he exited the room. Lyra exhaled, feeling the weight lift off her shoulders. She knew this was only the beginning, that there would be more challenges ahead. But in that moment, she felt a surge of pride. She had stood her ground. And for the first time, she knew that she was no longer just a princess. She was her own person. The tension in the palace continued to grow. Lord Varric's visit had been just the beginning. News of Lyra's engagement to Jason had spread like wildfire through the Vethrolian court, and the Royal Council was in an uproar. Many saw her decision as a direct challenge to the traditions that had kept their people strong for centuries. It wasn't just about the marriage. It was about everything Lyra's choice represented: change, defiance, and the breaking of old customs. Despite the growing pressure, Lyra remained resolute. She spent more time with Jason, discussing their future and making plans. But even with his support, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was building, ready to break. Then came the day when the storm hit. Lyra was in the palace gardens, taking a rare moment of quiet to clear her mind. The weather was calm, the air cool and crisp, but in the back of her mind, the impending conflict loomed. She was interrupted by one of the palace guards. "Princess," the guard said, bowing slightly, "there is someone here to see you. It's urgent." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. "Who is it?" "Lady Calla," the guard replied. Lyra's stomach tightened. Lady Calla was a member of the Royal Council and one of her most outspoken critics. She had always been a fierce defender of tradition and had made it clear on several occasions that she disapproved of Lyra's leadership. "Send her in," Lyra said, trying to steady her nerves. Lady Calla entered the garden with her usual air of authority. Her sharp eyes scanned Lyra for a moment before she spoke. "Princess," she said coldly, "I come with a message that you must hear. The council has made its decision." Lyra's heart pounded. She knew what was coming. "What decision?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Your engagement to Jason Ford has been deemed unacceptable," Lady Calla announced. "The council has unanimously voted to strip you of your title as heir to the Vethrolian throne." Lyra felt the world tilt beneath her. She had expected resistance, but not this. You can't do that," she said, her voice shaking. "I am the rightful heir. You don't have the authority to strip me of my birthright." Lady Calla's expression was unmoved. "The council has spoken, Princess. You are no longer fit to lead. Your decision to marry a human has not only offended tradition, but it has shown that you lack the judgment needed to rule. The throne must pass to someone who understands the importance of our people's values." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She had never imagined that her people would go this far. The weight of their decision pressed down on her like a crushing force. For the first time in her life, she felt completely alone. "I will not stand down," Lyra said firmly, finding strength she hadn't known she had. "I will not be pushed aside because of my choice. I am still your princess, and I will not let anyone take that from me." Lady Calla raised an eyebrow. "You have no choice but to obey. The council's decision is final." Lyra stood tall, her gaze never leaving Lady Calla's. "I will not obey a decision made out of fear. If I am no longer heir, so be it. But I will not turn my back on Jason, and I will not betray who I am." For a moment, Lady Calla said nothing. Then, with a sharp nod, she turned and walked away, leaving Lyra alone in the garden. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around her. Lyra stood still, the weight of the council's decision heavy in her chest. But something inside her refused to break. She had made her choice, and she would live with the consequences, no matter what. She looked out at the horizon, knowing the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But she was ready. She had Jason by her side, and together they would fight for their future. The decision had been made. The Royal Council had stripped Lyra of her title as heir to the throne, and the shock of that betrayal still echoed in her mind. But despite the pain, she felt something else. Freedom. For the first time in her life, she was no longer bound by the expectations of her people or her birthright. She could live for herself now, and that thought brought her a sense of peace. Jason had been with her every step of the way. He never once wavered, never once suggested that she should change her mind or give in to the council's demands. He had always believed in her, in the strength of her spirit. The day after the council's decision, Lyra and Jason stood together on the palace balcony. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the landscape. The city below them seemed peaceful, unaware of the turmoil above. Jason turned to her, his gaze steady. "You know this isn't the end, right?" he asked softly. Lyra nodded, her eyes focused on the horizon. "I know. It feels like the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another." Jason smiled. "Exactly. We may not have the throne, but we have each other. And we have the power to create our own future." not dictated by tradition, but by our own choices. Lyra looked at him, the weight in her chest lifting a little more. He was right. No matter what the council had decided, they could still build something together. Their love, their bond, was something no one could take away. I've never known a love like this, Lyra admitted, her voice barely a whisper. It's real. And it's mine. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm making a decision for me, not for my people or my birthright. Jason took her hand, squeezing it gently. That's the way it should be. I love you, Lyra. No matter what anyone else says or thinks, I'll stand by you. And in that moment, Lyra knew that this was all she needed. They didn't need the throne, the power, or the approval of the council. They had each other. And that was enough. Over the next few weeks, the palace was filled with rumors and murmurs, but Lyra and Jason remained unaffected. They spent their days together, planning their future. Jason continued his diplomatic work, building a bridge between the Vithrolian people and humanity, while Lyra found new ways to help her people, ways that didn't rely on the crown. The Vithrolian people began to see that their princess was not just a symbol of tradition. She was a woman with strength, determination, and a willingness to fight for what she believed in. Slowly, some of the whispers in the court began to quiet. Even the more conservative members of the council started to see that Lyra had the potential to lead, just not in the way they had expected. One day, an unexpected visitor arrived at the palace. It was Lord Varric. He stood before Lyra in the grand hall, his expression less cold than before. "Princess," he said, his voice softer than it had ever been, "I may not agree with your choice, but I see now that you are not a fool. You have shown strength, and perhaps you have chosen a path that will lead to a future where Vithrolians and humans can coexist." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. "Lord Varric, are you saying that you—" He nodded. "I still believe in tradition, but I also believe that sometimes tradition needs to evolve. Maybe you were right to choose a different path." Lyra's eyes softened, a small smile forming on her lips. "Thank you." It wasn't the approval she had once thought she needed, but it was enough. With Jason by her side, and with the support of those who truly saw her, Lyra knew that she was ready for whatever came next. The future was no longer a burden, it was a new beginning, one full of possibility. Together, Lyra and Jason would build a future where love, not tradition, would lead the way.